Alright, so our next tissue type is going to be connective, and as we mentioned earlier, connective tissue is going to connect and bind and support. One of the things that is going to be different about connective tissue is the extracellular matrix that it's got. There's a very wide diversity of connective tissue, and it mostly has to do with the material that you'll find in the matrix, or that extracellular material. And so what that means is you're going to have cells, but there's going to be a lot of material outside of the cells, and that's going to determine the connective tissue and what it does. Now, connective tissue is very abundant. You're going to find it in every organ in some way, and it's got a lot of different functions because of its variety of structures. And so in terms of general characteristics, even though the tissues vary, there are typically three things that they have in common. They're going to have cells, and the cells will vary from connective tissue to connective tissue. Like, for instance, bones will have osteocytes, and cartilage will have chondrocytes, and fat will have adipocytes, blood will have blood cells. But they're all going to have a specific type or multiple types of cells that make them up. And then those cells are going to secrete substances that are going to surround them, and we call that a ground substance. And so it's just going to be the material that makes up that outside environment primarily. This is going to be the major component of that extracellular matrix, is that ground substance. And it's described as amorphous, which just means it kind of has an irregular shape. It's not going to be something that is very uniform. And the cells themselves are what are creating this ground substance, which in most cases is a fluid, but in the case of some tissues like bone, it's going to be a solid structure. And then the third component is going to be your protein fibers. And so you're going to see collagen, elastin, and reticular fibers. And so depending on the types and the amount of fibers, that will give that tissue certain characteristics. And so a lot of times these proteins are going to be crisscrossing all throughout that extracellular matrix. And so as you can see, when it was described as amorphous, you can see that there's not really a regular pattern. But within a connective tissue, you're going to find cells, you're going to find the ground substance, and you're going to find these protein fibers. And so depending on the types of cells, the types of fibers, and the material of the ground substance, that's how you're going to get all of these different types of connective tissue. And so we can put it into three broad categories. We have connective tissue proper, and these are going to have cell types and protein fibers in a viscous ground substance, which just means it's kind of a thick liquid. And so we have loose connective tissue. This is going to be very abundant in our body. The fibers are a little looser in their organization versus dense connective tissue, which is going to be more reinforced, and they're going to have thicker bundles. And then you have your supportive connective tissues. These are going to be things like bone and cartilage. They have fewer types of cells, and they're densely packed, and so they're going to be stronger for that support. And then you're going to have your fluid connective tissue, which are going to circulate in a liquidy type fluid, and that's going to be your lymph and your blood. And so once again, a pretty wide variety of tissues in connective tissue. So a lot of these we're not really going to talk about in detail, or really any of these we're not going to talk about in detail in this lesson, but as we go into the different systems, we will talk about them more, like for instance the bone or the cartilage. The loose connective tissues, that's going to be things like your areolar tissue. They're going to connect a lot of your organs together. Your adipose, which is fat. You're going to have your dense connective tissues, like you'll find in your dermis. Different cartilages for support, bone for support, and then your liquid ones here. And so just the general functions and some examples that you will find in the connective tissue category. They can enclose and separate other tissues. And so one of the things we talked about in a previous video were the membranes. And like your serous membranes, they were composed of both epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Your synovial membranes were connective tissue, and so they can kind of form these capsules that are protecting and separating. They can connect tissues, like the connective tissue name implies, like tendons and ligaments. They can support and help the body move, like the case of bones. They can store compounds, like adipose stores fat. Bones can store minerals. They can cushion and insulate. That's another function of our fat tissue. They can transport, like the lymph and the blood. They are those fluid connective tissues that can transport gases, nutrients, lost fluids, things of that nature. And then they can also be protective because those blood cells, the white blood cells especially, they're going to help protect us against pathogens as part of our immune system. And so matching the function with the example, we have encloses and separates. That was our membranes. Protection, that is going to be those white blood cells that help in our immune system. Transportation, that's going to be our blood. Storage, that's going to be our adipose. Cushioning and insulation, that's also going to be our adipose. Support and movement would be bones, and connecting one another, or connecting one structure to another, that would be ligaments and tendons. All right, now the last little bit about connective tissue is where it comes from. And so the last video, the last section of this set of notes is about your germ layers. And essentially as an embryo, before you have specialized parts, you just have unspecialized cells called stem cells. And so in the case of connective tissue, all connective tissues from blood to bone to fat, they are all going to come from a stem cell line known as mesenchyme. And so this one particular type of stem cell line is going to give rise to all of the different types of your connective tissues. And so in the embryo, these are going to be found in the mesoderm, and we'll talk about what that is in another video. It's the middle layer of embryonic tissue. And then as an adult, there are still some mesenchymal cells that are going to be scattered throughout those adult tissues, like in bone marrow, that allow us to continue making some of those connective tissue cells that will become the tissues. And we'll finish up in our next video.